All right, folks, welcome back. Welcome to the 11th week of class. We are very, very close to the end. It's really nice, but we're not quite there. Obviously, there's a lot going on still. But it doesn't mean you can't handle it. It doesn't mean you don't have enough time to take care of it. You have plenty of time. If you manage your time properly, you've got about 5 weeks to get everything done. Papers, midterms, finals. A lot going on, a lot going to be on your plate. This is the time to really just kind of like give yourself over to this process. Just don't relent. Don't let feelings of just like feeling pressured and like stress get to you. Everybody experiences it. It's part of the nature of what we all go through here. And so it's what you have to learn to kind of just push through and just push yourself to keep working and accomplishing things that you may not want to do. You may not want to spend the time to do because you have all these other great alternatives available to you. It doesn't matter. You need to learn via these processes, like this last third of the semester, to really like kind of get yourself to that level where you can just like work through anything, work through any circumstances, hit any deadline. Get as much work done as is presented to you. Like that is a large part of what you're here to do, to really learn what you're capable of and get comfortable working that much so that you can then get out into the world and just operate at that level. Sometimes you're going to be given tasks that are going to require a lot of time and effort on your part out there. And if you don't know that you are capable of working for extended hours on things that you are not even familiar with, then you're not going to be confident that you're going to be able to do those kind of things. That lack of certainty is going to be very transparent, and that will affect your ability to kind of, move your way towards the things that you want. So it is certainly worth your time to just like dive in these next few weeks. And regardless of what it is that happens that might get in the way of school, like, you got to push through it. You got to put those things aside, and you got to make this the priority, the thing that you do. This is what you do these next 5 weeks. Once that's over, summer break will hit. You have a nice, good chunk of time to kind of just feel good about what you did here. And, again, like I always say, not harbor that like regret and resentment because, you just didn't quite get what you wanted out of the semester. So make sure to avoid that. And, green pastures are ahead, but definitely there is some sort of turbulent ground to cover still. And again, these are the times that matter with respect to making you stronger people, with making you the kind of people that you are fully capable of being, and the kind of people that go out into the world and succeed. So again, give yourself over to it. It will be worth your time. All right, so we have come to the final chapter of the second part of the course, the final week of the second part of the course. As you know, next Tuesday is the second exam. So ideally, everything will work out well then. I hope it will. I hope you've been doing what I've been asking you to do, which is like learning this stuff as we move along so that, you just don't leave everything up till the last moment to learn it and ultimately not learn it well enough and therefore walk away from an exam not doing too well. Like, hopefully you've been plugged into everything we've been doing and acknowledging that this next part of the course that you are currently like undertaking is very connected, and it requires you to kind of like be able to build up your knowledge from the stuff that we started learning to now, which again required us establishing the nature of production via the production model, both in the short run and the long run, and then taking that information and deriving our costs from that, which then establish the costs that firms face in relation to the benefits they get from selling in markets, which then allows us to study how firms can optimally make decisions and ultimately figure out how prices are set in these different market settings. As I mentioned before, the models that we use, like, they're very specific, and so they don't necessarily cover every single possible scenario in the world, but they'll give you a lot of the basis of how things operate so that then you can have that as a means of sort of comparing whatever it is you are involved in, to the information that you learn in class in a very controlled setting where everything's very sort of assumed to be sort of streamlined and as obvious as possible. Obviously, the world doesn't work like that. But if you understand this stuff, then you gain like this basic intuition that then helps you to kind of maneuver the world a little bit better, at least the business world. And of course, if you're an economist, this stuff is pivotal because it is central to every model that's used in economics, both micro and macro. And so the better you learn this stuff, the better you'll be at whatever it is you wind up applying your knowledge to in the economics discipline at whatever level you choose to work towards. So the first setting that we considered looking at sort of the costs and benefits of in order to establish like the nature of how prices are set is the perfectly competitive setting, which is what we covered last week. So we took the information that we learned in the prior two chapters, and we set up a very specific set of conditions for the type of market environment that a firm can operate in. In those markets, we had the maximum number of possible firms that could be operating. So there's as much competition as possible on the part of sellers, and there's as many buyers as there could be for the good. So there's a lot of competition amongst buyers as well. So no side has any ability to set prices. Everybody's a price taker in a perfectly competitive market. The thing that's being sold is a very general good. It's a standardized product. We call it a commodity sometimes. These things generally fall within the categories of like agriculture or like raw inputs that are used to produce. Things that you cannot take and make a special version of. You cannot say, oh, this is my special type of iron ore that is different from everybody else's iron ore, and therefore you are able to charge a higher price for it. That's not the case in perfectly competitive markets. Everybody's selling the same thing. Nobody can do anything special with it. Everybody just takes the price. So everybody does take the price and did take the price in the model that we looked at. So that established the benefit of selling the marginal revenue, which was equal to the price for those perfectly competitive firms. They set their optimal output level at the point where the price equaled their marginal costs. And then depending on whether or not the average variable cost was above or below that, that dictated whether or not the firm should operate. And whether or not the average total cost was above or below that, that dictated whether or not there were profits or not. And so we went through all the various characteristics of those markets, the individual firms within those markets, and what kind of insights we can gain, Gesundheit, about those markets. So that was one end of the competitive spectrum. Now we're moving to the other end of the competitive spectrum, which is the least competitive case that a firm might find themselves in, and that is, of course, the case of a monopoly. There's only one firm in the market. The firm dominates the market, defines the market. Another thing we talked about in perfectly competitive markets was that there are no barriers to entry, and so there's entry and exit in the long run. Firms can enter or exit the industry in the long run. That's not the case with a monopoly. Firms cannot do that, because if they could do that, there wouldn't be only one firm operating. So there are very significant barriers to entry with monopoly. Also, in perfectly competitive markets, you're going to get the most efficient market outcome, meaning that the markets are working the best they possibly can for all participants. Consumer and producer surplus is maximized. Maximum efficiency is achieved in those markets. There's no dead weight loss of some of that efficiency. Every mutually beneficial transaction that can occur does occur. Not the case in monopoly, completely the opposite case. There are going to be mutually beneficial transactions that don't happen in monopoly markets, because monopolists have market power. They have the ability to charge above their market price. And because they're able to do that, they wind up limiting the amount of output that is transacted in the market, and that causes a loss of efficiency. So society loses, but the firms gain, because there are several profits to be made by these firms in these markets, and we'll analyze how that looks in a second. And so, again, it's a complete opposite case from perfectly competitive market, and we start off with the sort of the extreme ends of the spectrum to, again, sort of establish like, like the bounds of possibilities that markets can sort of look like. And anytime you're going to do any kind of analysis, you always kind of need to do that. You always kind of need to say, well, on this end of the spectrum, it can get this good, and at this end of the spectrum, it can get this bad. And then you talk about the in-between cases, which are generally going to be more realistic. And you always have like the bounds, the edges to kind of compare the middle cases to provide more insight into whatever it is you're analyzing. And that's why we jump from perfect competition to monopoly. As far as this course goes, we cut it off there for the second exam, but then we jump to the next set of cases, which are the more complicated cases, the in-between cases that involve kind of varying market settings that have characteristics from both sides of the ends of the spectrum. So you have monopolistically competitive markets in which you have a lot of competition, like you do in perfectly competitive markets, but the firms have some market power as well. They have some ability to charge above their marginal costs. And in those markets, generally, the things that are being sold are very similar. They're close substitutes to the things that everybody else is selling. So if you think about like the hamburger market, everybody's selling hamburgers, but McDonald's sells a Big Mac, Burger King sells a Whopper, etc. Everybody's selling a hamburger, but everybody's selling a different kind of version of the same thing. And that's what monopolistically competitive markets are. And they'll have characteristics of both monopoly and perfect competition. And then finally, we have the oligopoly setting, which is the last market setting we'll study, which involves a few large firms dominating the market. And what's most tricky about that setting is that the firms can benefit from the market in the same way that a monopolist does, and therefore earn the maximum amount of profits if they were to work together. But they can't do that because laws prohibit that in Western nations. And so they sort of try to figure out ways to kind of circumvent that, either directly or indirectly. If they're not able to do so, no matter what the case is, the decisions they make are dependent on what their rivals make, because the markets are, again, the market shares are large. There's a small number of firms. They could operate like a monopoly, and because of that, they share the market. And so if somebody's making a decision to either increase or decrease output, that's moving the entire market along a demand curve. And that means everybody needs to react to it. And so, as you'll notice with perfect competition and monopoly, the things that these firms have to take into consideration are only basically their internal cost conditions and maybe like signals that they're getting from outside the market, such as like the price being set by all firms and all sellers, all buyers in a perfectly competitive market. In oligopoly, the firms need to do all of that, but they also need to take into consideration what are their competitors doing, because again, the competitors' decisions will affect their decisions. So there's interdependence in decision making, and therefore the models that we use to explain those markets are more complicated to take into account this extra sort of complication that they face, which is why we have a couple of chapters to cover oligopoly. And so that's what's coming. And again, like it's going to continue building, and it doesn't get simpler, which is again why I don't make the final cumulative, because in a way, in an indirect way, it is cumulative. Like you are sort of expected to understand everything in order to be able to understand the last 4 chapters. I don't know if it's 4. It might be 5. I think it's 5 chapters. But nonetheless, the material in the final part of the course will depend on your ability to sort of understand everything we've covered so far. So that's that. Anyway, so this is where we're at, and that is where we're going. And now I'm ready to continue on with today's material, which is the Monopoly chapter. We'll finish on Thursday. I may have already. Did I already open up the homework for chapter 11? I did. Okay, excellent. Okay, so that's been open. It's there. Mini paper for Chapter 11. I'll have that due the week after the exam, so you have some time to work on if you want. But another thing to keep in mind is that we are slowly starting to run out of mini paper options. We're not quite there yet, but just keep that in mind. If you've been leaving the paper up to the last moment, which I hope you have not, I hope you've knocked it out already, because that is the best thing to do. Just get it done early. If you haven't done that, you better jump on it now, because if not, you're going to write a crappy paper in a rush, and it's just going to be a mess for everyone, including you, who will get a bad grade. And so you want to get a good grade on it, put some real time into it while you have time to put into it, and make sure that at least that part of the course is taken care of. Even though if you fail all the exams and you do well in the paper, you'll still fail the class, because this is not an English course. So you need to be able to actually know and demonstrate you've learned economics at this level. So make sure that that's happening. But if you're not taking care of the paper and you're doing well in the exams, it's going to hurt your grade too. So just make sure you knock the paper out, get it done sooner rather than later, and that's that. Are there any questions about anything you'd like me to address before I move on with the material? Excellent. All right, so we'll define monopoly today, and then we'll talk about the 5 sources of monopoly, and then we'll talk about the profit maximizing condition for a monopolist. And that'll be it for the day. That should take us to the end. All right, so let's define monopoly. Monopoly is a market served by just a single seller of a product, and the product has no close substitute. So again, unlike in a perfectly competitive market where the good is a standardized good, it's a commodity, very general thing that everybody can sell, iron ore, oil, things that just, again, you cannot make special. In a monopoly case, the thing that's being sold, only the one company can sell. And we'll talk about why that might be. An actual monopoly market is difficult to define in practice. Sometimes it's difficult to find an example, or sometimes it might depend on how the market is defined. So one way that we can define a market is by looking at what are called cross-price elasticities. So the key distinguishing feature is the control that individual firms have over prices, the market power. Empirically, one can examine the cross-price elasticity of demand for close substitutes to figure out if a market can be defined as a monopoly or not. So the cross-price elasticity is a measure of the responsiveness of the demand for a good to changes in the price of a related good, as opposed to the other elasticities we've looked at, which is just like the own price elasticity of demand, where again, that's the percent change in quantity demanded with respect to the percent change in price of the same good, and also the elasticity of supply, which is the percent change in quantity supplied over the percent change in the price. So this is the percent change in quantity demanded of a good in relation to the percent change in price of a related good. So it is the ratio of the percent change in quantity demanded of some good X over the percent change in the price of some good Y. When goods X and Y are substitutes, an increase in the price of Y leads to an increase in the demand for X, right? They are substitutes. So, if the price of one goes up, then the consumers buy less of that good and buy more of the substitutes. Again, this means that if price goes up, quantity demanded goes up. So that means they'll both be positive. So whenever the cross-price elasticity of demand is positive, the goods are going to be substitutes for each other. When the goods are complements, an increase in the price of Y leads to a decrease in the demand for X. So again, we're talking about goods that are bought together. Coffee and sugar, let's say. So if the price of coffee goes up, people buy less coffee, but they also buy less sugar because most people take sugar with their coffee. So if the cross-price elasticity of demand is negative, then the goods are considered complements. And of course, the magnitude of the cross-price elasticity of demand tells us how close of substitutes and complements the goods might be. So if there's a situation in a market where it looks like there's a lot of market share consolidation, where like a firm is starting to become dangerously too big and dominating the market to the extent that it maybe could become a monopolist, because as firms get bigger, they generally in certain market settings will have increasing returns to scale, decreasing average total cost in the long run. That means that they'll have a cost advantage over their competitors. That means their competitors can only compete if they get as large as them. Sometimes firms will get so large that they'll just knock everybody else out of the market and they'll be the only seller. In that case, then we've got, at least we may still have, it depends, government agencies that are there to oversee these type of things and make sure that markets don't get too concentrated and we don't have just monopolists reigning freely. And so the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission will analyze the situation. And one of the things they'll look at is the cross-price elasticity of demand to see if some goods are either related or not, to the extent that we can then say, well, then a market is either narrowly defined or more broadly defined, which once the determination is made, will elucidate whether or not the market may be in danger of becoming a monopoly or not, if a firm gets too much market power. So one example in the book is the DuPont case. In 1956, the DuPont Corporation was charged with having a monopoly on the sale of cellophane, right? Just plastic wrap. They sold 80% of cellophane, yet they were able to defend themselves once they were, basically sued by the government because they had too large of a market share. They were able to defend themselves by claiming that the cross-price elasticities between closed substitutes, wax paper, and aluminum foils was very high, which then allowed them to lump the three into a common market. So they argued again that the cross-price elasticities basically established that the market wasn't as narrow as they claimed, and therefore they didn't have a monopoly over the sale of, cellophane, which can be then put into this broader category of, maybe other types of wrapping for food. So defining the three products as an industry led DuPont to only have 20% of the market share, and therefore they got a ruling in their favor. So again, defining a monopoly in practice can be tricky, but there are definitely clear cases of monopolies that exist. And some of them exist naturally, as we'll talk about in a second. In the situations where it's natural for there to be only one firm dominating the market, then the government will play a very active role in regulating those firms. So their prices won't be able to be the highest they can possibly get them. And there is more consideration taken into account for the consumer side of the market. Anyway, so let's look at some specific sort of attributes that set a monopoly aside from the case of perfect competition. So in the perfectly competitive market, as we saw last week, the market, again, is made up of many sellers, many buyers, and so that model of supply and demand that you guys are so familiar with is revealed to be a model of a perfectly competitive market that sets an equilibrium price, which from the perspective of a firm is something they can't affect. So therefore, the demand they face is a perfectly elastic demand curve. It is also equal to their marginal revenue curve because their marginal revenue is constant. The extra revenue they gain from selling additional units is equal to the price. So essentially, to set their optimal level of output, they set their marginal cost equal to their marginal revenue, which is equal to price. And the marginal revenue curve is the demand that they face. It's the perfectly elastic demand. Perfectly elastic meaning it's as sensitive as possible to price changes. A firm tries to raise their price by even a penny. Quantity demanded goes down to zero. Why? Because consumers know that there's X amount of other sellers out there, huge amount. X equals a big amount that will sell the good at the going market price. And so if you try to raise your price as a perfectly competitive firm, the perfectly elastic demand will get you down to zero in terms of your sales. For a monopoly, the demand curve that they face is the industry demand curve. Because again, they are the only seller in the market. And so they face a downward sloping demand curve. And so if they want to increase their output or decrease their output, they can, but they are beholden to what consumers are willing to pay at those various quantities, but they are able to raise and lower prices at whim. And so that's going to have implications for their output decision, because their marginal revenue, their extra revenue they'll gain from selling additional units, will not be equal to the price. It will be less than the price, which I'll talk more about in a second. But let's just, again, broadly talk about like the sources of monopoly, the conditions in a market that are most common that will allow for a monopoly to exist. So one is exclusive control over important inputs, right? So in perfectly competitive markets, you have free entry and exit. Free entry means that any firm can come in, set up shop, and start doing what they need to do to sell the same thing that everybody else is selling. That means there's no trouble at all getting a hold of what you need to produce, the raw materials, the machines, etc. For a monopolist, in a firm, if a firm has exclusive control over certain inputs, like let's say a raw material that they maybe have the only access to, or a type of machine that you need to produce maybe a certain kind of bolt or something that is proprietary to the firm. They developed it. Nobody else has it, so nobody else can create that special type of bolt or whatever that's needed to create a special type of product. Whatever it is, there are inputs that the firm is able to get a hold of that nobody else is able to get a hold of, which stops other firms from entering the industry. Another important source of monopoly power is economies of scale. Again, decreasing average total costs in the long run, and that is reflective of the technology that a firm uses. So economies of scale exists whenever long-run average costs decline as output increases. And of course, we also talked about in the cost chapter the fact that firms can get too big and get into the upward sloping, increasing range of average total cost in the long run, in which if they get too big, the average cost of producing will start to increase. And that is the range of diseconomies of scale. Anyway, so this is a situation that a firm might find itself in, where here's the average total cost of production, here's the minimum cost output, meaning the amount of output that will lower the average cost of producing. And here's the amount that the monopolist is interested in supplying. The price they can charge is whatever people are willing to pay for that amount. And here is their average total cost of producing, so therefore there is a profit being made for this firm. So in order to be able to get to this point, the firm needs to have invested a lot of fixed costs, which will then result in the firm operating over the decreasing range of their average total cost curve. And that's because if a firm pays a lot for their fixed costs, then remember, average total cost is made up of average fixed cost and average variable costs. Both of them are acting on the average total cost of producing. Average fixed cost is equal to the fixed cost divided by the quantity. So it's a number that's not changing divided by a number that is getting bigger and bigger as the firm gets bigger and bigger, which means that the average cost of producing is being brought down over a long range if they spent a lot of money on fixed costs initially. And that's generally going to be the case with industries that are require not just maybe a lot of machinery and buildings, etc., but maybe like a large distribution network. So if you think about like utilities all require some large distribution network to be able to supply their electricity, their internet services, etc., to large populations. And so that requires a lot of investment. You've got to set up those networks. You got to set up those pipes. You got to set up those electric lines. That's a lot of money, but those are fixed costs. And so generally with those type of industries, you're going to get them operating on the decreasing average total cost, which ultimately will be in the long run the average cost curve, which means that they need to be big. Any other firm would need to be as big in order to be able to enjoy those economies of scale that this big firm is enjoying. But even if they do manage to get into the market, what happens is like there's only a certain amount of supply that might be profitable in those markets. And so let's say this is the monopolist amount that results from this one utility having set up shop, operating at this level, being profitable, and then another firm comes in and says, yeah, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to set up my own distribution network. I'm going to spend the fixed cost, and I'm going to sell the same thing you are. I'm going to be your competitor. Well, there's only so much that people are willing to buy, and so the monopoly amount will then need to be divided between two firms. So if there's two firms operating in this market, they will each be supplying QM divided by 2, which means that they will incur an average cost of production, which will be greater than what people are willing to pay. Therefore, if two firms operate in a market like that, you're going to get firms operating at a loss. So it doesn't make sense, even in a case like this, for another firm to enter and set up their own distribution network and incur all these costs. And so when you have that kind of situation, you have what's called a natural monopoly. And it's generally going to be due to economies of scale. And that's going to be a situation where the government will come in and regulate. And we'll talk more about what those regulations will look like at the end of this chapter. A third source of monopoly power are patents. Of course, just legal barriers that stop other firms from being even able to produce the thing that the firm is producing, right? It could be a patent on, different types of drugs that maybe pharmaceutical companies develop, or it could be like a copyright on some intellectual property that stops other firms from being able to sell whatever it is being sold. So there's different forms that these legal barriers can take, patents being the most common of them. But with patents, of course, because it is sort of a legally established way of having a monopoly, and a monopoly does cause efficiency, there is, a very reasonable sentiment in our society that established that there should be a limit to how long these legal barriers exist. And so even firms that do establish like patents or any type of legal right to produce a specific type of good, that will only last a certain amount of time because there is a trade-off to society, right? Like with a monopolist, we're going to have inefficiency. We're going to have a loss. We're going to have deadweight loss. We're going to have consumers being hurt. Prices are too high. And so that's a problem. But also we do need the incentive for firms to be able to invest in research and development and to innovate, or else, we would sort of not be moving forward as far as our technological progress to the extent that we have been if we take away the incentive to do so. And so there is a trade-off there. There's a push and pull that goes on at several levels of our government with respect to this issue. There's a lot of debate always going on about this issue, but the consensus is that there should be an expiration time for these legal rights, and so there are. But another thing that will curtail the patent right to produce is just the fact that over time, like firms will reverse engineer a lot of these products and figure out how they're being made. And really, if they just switch out a piece with something else or just change the formula slightly, then they essentially are able to create something very similar to what is being produced by the monopolist, which will erode monopoly power as well. So over time, legal barriers will be eroded and monopoly power will be eroded in situations where legal barriers are the source. Another source of monopoly power is what are called network economies. So network economies exist when the value of the good that's being consumed increases as more people use the good. So if you think about like Microsoft Windows, it's an operating system. There's other ones. There's Linux. There's the operating system on Apple. But beyond that, like most computers have Windows on it. It's just a given now. You buy any computer, Windows is on it. And the reason for that is because everybody uses Windows. Like everybody uses Windows, aside from people that use Apple or whatever, and maybe those that use Linux. But the majority of people use Windows, and everybody knows it. And so not only does Microsoft get to enjoy the benefit of having such a large amount of the market share, just because people prefer to buy their operating system, but also all programs are designed to work on Windows. Obviously Microsoft owns all the all the Office programs, but even like the Adobe programs, they're programmed to work on Windows. There's specific versions of them that are programmed to work on Apple, but all the dominant software that we all depend on, browsers, etc., are all based on that platform. And so the fact that we all kind of indirectly agree that this was like our operating system of choice ultimately led it to have the most value in the market, which ultimately stopped other firms from coming in and competing with them. So there were these network economies that existed that Microsoft took advantage of that allowed them to essentially now have a monopoly over the operating system market. You see it in all sorts of digital platforms. There are other social media platforms besides Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, but nobody cares because everybody uses these other ones. And so there's a lot of value in the ones that are being used. They get all the advertising money. They get everybody downloading their apps and paying them for the download if they're buying the premium version, whatever. And so all of these firms get to enjoy the network economies of just basically being the most popular version of their product. So again, in the worst case scenario, given this condition, that will result in a monopoly. And then, of course, finally, government licenses or franchises. The government itself can just simply state, you are the one firm that will supply this one thing, this one service. Like we need a very specific type of missile built, and you are the firm that will build it. Nobody else will be able to compete against you because you have our contract and you have the legal right to produce it, and therefore that firm will have a monopoly over that type of missile. So governments can just grant monopoly power at will. All right, now let's talk about the profit maximizing monopolist. So assume the goal is to maximize profits as it has been from the beginning. Again, like I talked about last time, when we're talking about maximizing profits, we're talking about maximizing the value of a firm because firms are valued on their contracts that represent profits into the future, right? So the present discounted value of their profits into the future is how firms are valued. And so that's why we assume the goal of firms is to maximize profits because they're maximizing their value. All right, so firms choose the level of output for which the difference between total revenue and total cost is their greatest, right? That's profit, the difference between total revenue and total cost. So this is the total revenue curve for the perfectly competitive market. Again, marginal revenue is constant. It's equal to price. Price times quantity is equal to total revenue. The derivative of total revenue is marginal revenue. If it's constant, you're going to get a constant derivative. You're going to get a constant slope to the total revenue curve. You're going to get a straight line. So that is not the case for a monopolist because a monopolist faces that downward sloping demand curve. So facing that downward sloping demand curve means that if they want to increase the amount that they're going to sell, they need to lower the price. And as we learned in the, I think it was the 3rd or 4th chapter, there's a relationship between total revenues and the elasticity of demand along the demand curve. So at high prices, so down here is the elasticity of demand. And so you're going to get elastic demand over high prices. Elastic demand means that as the price is decreased, that total revenues will increase. And so marginal revenue will be positive along that range. And total revenues will be at their maximum whenever the derivative is equal to 0, whenever their marginal revenue is equal to 0. So that's the point that corresponds to the highest amount of revenue that this type of firm can make. And that corresponds to the point where elasticity is equal to 1. So demand is unit elastic. Beyond that point, where demand becomes inelastic, where the elasticity becomes less than 1 in absolute value, the marginal revenue starts to become negative as we move from left to right, meaning the slope of the total revenue curve starts to decrease. And again, that happens past the point where the demand is unit elastic, where demand is inelastic over this range here. So instead of getting a straight positively sloped total revenue curve, you're going to have a hump-shaped total revenue curve in which the total revenues will increase, maximize, and then decrease over the range of demand that a firm is facing. So here again is the total revenue curve. Here is the total cost curve that we assume for most firms. Again, having marginal cost decrease initially and then start to increase due to diminishing returns to labor, and then increasing returns to labor and then diminishing returns to labor, which is what causes the total cost curve to look like that. And so obviously the firm is looking to operate over the range where profits are positive. So obviously the range over which our revenue curve exceeds the total cost curve. So over this range, the firm will be profitable. Here's our economic profit curve, kind of tracking out the difference between these two. We see that it's positive over this range here, and it's at its maximum at the point where the two curves are furthest apart from each other. So that's the point that the firm wants to operate at, the point at which their profits are maximized, the point at which their overall total costs and total revenues are furthest away from each other, with total revenue exceeding total costs. So at that point where the curves are furthest apart from each other and therefore profits are maximized, it also happens to be that the slopes of the costs and the revenue curves are equivalent. So not surprising, the point at which the firm maximizes its profits is the point at which its marginal cost, extra cost of producing additional units, is equal to the marginal revenue, the extra revenue from selling additional units. So let's look at the marginal revenue once again more closely. The slope of the total revenue curve is, of course, the derivative of the slope of the total revenue curve is the marginal revenue, and it is a derivative of our total revenue curve. Total revenue is with respect to quantity. A profit maximizing monopolist in the short run will choose a level of output Q star for which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that is the optimality condition for a monopolist. A monopolist maximizes profits by choosing the level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And again, that's different from a perfectly competitive firm, because for a perfectly competitive firm, price is equal to marginal revenue. And so they set marginal cost equal to price. But for a monopolist, marginal revenue is less than price. So for a monopolist, the marginal revenue is less than price. And again, the reason for that is because they face a downward sloping demand curve. As they decide to supply more, let's say from 100 to 150, they're able to generate more revenue from the extra units sold. In this case, 50 units times $50, so that's $2,500. But by adding additional units, they have to lower the price on existing units they were selling. And so that means that for these 100 units they were selling at $60 that are now going to be sold at $50, they're going to lose some revenues. So again, in this case, it's going to be 100 times 10, so that's $1,000 that they're losing. So the extra revenue they gain by selling additional units is not equal to the price that they can charge, but it's equal to the price minus the amount they lose on the amount that they had to lower the price on the existing units that were being sold. So the extra revenue they gain by selling additional units is the quantity effect of a price change, and the revenue they lose by lowering the price is called the price effect of a price change. So whenever this quantity effect outweighs the price effect, the marginal revenue will be positive. Past the point where demand is unit elastic, where marginal revenue is equal to zero, that's the point where, as the firm is increasing their output, their quantity effect is outweighed by the price effect, meaning the loss in revenues from lowering the price on existing units outweighs the extra revenue gained by selling additional units. Therefore, the extra revenue they gain from selling additional units will be negative. So obviously, that's not the point that the firms want to operate at. So they'll only operate at over the range where marginal revenue is positive. All right, let's just establish a clear-cut relationship between marginal revenue and elasticity mathematically. this is just a derivation. You don't have to actually know the derivation, but I want to go through it just so that you understand where this comes from. So marginal revenue is equal to the derivative of our total revenue curve with respect to quantity. Total revenue is equal to price as a function of quantity times the quantity. So this is our inverse demand function times quantity. So marginal revenue is the derivative of total revenue with respect to quantity. So there's quantity here and there's quantity there. So we're going to need to use the product rule to take the derivative of that. Thanks. All right. So doing that, you're going to get the derivative of the first function, which is q, which is equal to 1, times the second function, which is equal to price, plus the first function times the derivative of the second function, which is dp dq, which is the slope of the inverse demand function. Our elasticity is equal to 1 over the slope of the inverse demand function times price over quantity, something we derived a while back. So that implies that if we solve for the slope of the inverse demand function, that the slope of the inverse demand function would be equal to 1 over the elasticity times price over quantity. That means that we can plug this into this expression here. And then we've got price in both of these, so we can factor that out. So that means that marginal revenue equals price times 1 minus 1 over the price elasticity of demand. So that's the relationship between marginal revenue and the price elasticity of demand. As the price elasticity of demand gets bigger, this number gets smaller. So 1 minus the smaller number gets bigger. That means the price gets bigger. So as marginal revenue gets bigger, the price gets bigger. I'm sorry. So as the elasticity gets bigger, the marginal revenue gets bigger as well. So that's moving from right to left along the demand curve. So the less elastic with respect to price, the more the price exceeds marginal revenue. Here the price elasticity is very high, and so we see that the marginal revenue is going to be obviously positive and pretty close to the price there. And then as we get further away, elasticity gets smaller, and so then the marginal revenue, the difference between marginal revenue and price gets bigger as well. So anyway, all this is sort of just meant to like solidify that understanding of like what the relationship is between marginal revenue and elasticity, and the fact that marginal revenue is less than price for a monopolist, and that relationship changes as we move along the demand curve. So I don't expect you to actually know the numerical relationship between marginal revenue and elasticity, but just kind of understand that marginal revenue does change for a monopolist. It is not constant, and it's very much related to the elasticity of demand, which is also what is basically the reason why our total revenue curve is hump-shaped. It increases and decreases. All right, so here is the downward sloping demand curve for a monopolist. There is its marginal revenue curve, and there is the marginal cost curve. So once again, the monopolist is going to set their output, the profit maximizing level of output, at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So they'll basically set the amount they're willing to sell at that point there. And then the next step for them is to figure out how much people are willing to pay for that amount. So they, again, figure out their how much they're willing to sell based on the interaction of their costs, which reflect their production process, in relation to the extra revenue they can get from selling. That, again, is related to the demand. And then once they have that information, then they need to figure out how much to price. And the only way they can figure that out is by having information about what people are willing to pay for a certain quantity, and that is, the information they get from the inverse demand function, which again they can get from statistical analysis of their markets. Once they've established how much they're willing to supply and the price they're willing to supply it at, then they need to figure out if they're profitable or not. So that's where our average total cost curve comes in. Again, U-shaped, and bottom of the U happens at the point where marginal cost crosses it. At the optimal point of supply for this monopolist, they look at their average cost of producing, which happens to be below the price. That means that the difference between what they're charging for the individual unit and their average cost of producing, it is going to be positive. So there's profit there. Multiply that by the quantity they're selling, that optimal quantity they've set, and then you get the total amount of profits that the monopolist is able to reap. And graphically, it looks like this. So much like a perfectly competitive firm, you can have profits in the short run. But if you remember from last week, in the long run, those profits will be eroded in perfectly competitive markets. If there are profits being made, firms will enter the industry and eventually shift the supply curve to the point where the price is just tangent to the minimum of the average total cost curve, and therefore there are zero economic profits in the long run for those firms. That will not be the case for monopolists. Yeah. Right, they don't. No, yeah, they want the least amount of competition possible. The less the competition, the more the profits. Yeah.
So that's probably why, like, differentiate their product less competition.
Exactly. By doing that, they're able to make a version of the food that's different from others, and therefore they're able to get some profit from that. But that is actually the case of a monopolistically competitive market. And in those markets, there's zero economic profits as well in the long run, because firms can enter those markets as well. Like, there's no barriers to entry in those markets either. But yeah, definitely, like, by creating the idea that your very generic good is slightly different from everybody else's, you do get a little bit of market power, and that will increase your profits, definitely. And it also increases prices. All right, so a monopolist, again, is able to make profits in the short run, and again, it has everything to do with the position of the average total cost curve relative to the price they can charge at that optimal output level where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Practice problem 11.1. A monopolist faces the following inverse demand curve. P equals 100 minus 2Q. The short run total cost curve is equal to 640 plus 20Q. What is the profit maximizing price and quantity? All right, so one thing that you need to know, for a monopolist with a linear demand function, to get to the marginal revenue function, all you do is you double the slope in absolute value. So the marginal revenue for this firm is going to be 100 minus 4Q. The other way to do that is to, figure out the quantity. We'll multiply the price times quantity. So you'd multiply this times quantity, get to the total revenue, and then take the derivative of that, which would get you to that expression, 100 minus 4Q. But that's a shortcut that you can easily take if you know you can. So know you can, and therefore do it. So again, the profit maximizing monopolist sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So the marginal revenue is equal to 100 minus 4Q. Again, just double the slope in absolute value. Marginal cost is the derivative of our total cost function with respect to quantity, which is $20. And now we just do a little bit of algebra there and figure out what the optimal quantity is. So subtracting 100 from both sides, dividing both sides by -4 gets us to the optimal profit maximizing quantity to be the point, the amount of 20 units for this monopolist. Any questions on that? All right, to get the price for the monopolist, and the monopolist then needs to plug in their optimal quantity into their inverse demand function to figure out what people are willing to pay for it. So plugging in 20 bucks into the inverse demand function then gets us to a price of $60. So again, the trick is to just know how to get to your marginal revenue expression, and that is just doubling the slope in absolute value. What is the firm's profit? Profit is total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue is price times quantity. So we've got a price, 60, quantity 20, so that's going to get us our total revenue. And then we have to figure out the total cost of producing 20 units and subtract that from our total revenue. So total revenue is 1,200. Total cost is 640 plus 20 times 20, so that's equal to 400. So that's 400 plus 640 is equal to 1,040. So therefore, the profit is equal to 160. All right. So that's basically what we just figured out here. We looked at the profit maximizing level of output set at the point where marginal cost equaled marginal revenue. So that's going to be 20. And then we looked up to the demand curve to figure out what people are willing to pay for it, which is 60. And then we figured out the profits again with your standard sort of profit expression. All right, the monopolist shutdown condition. So remember, for a perfectly competitive firm, they would shut down if the price falls below the minimum of the average variable cost. So if the price is below the if the price is below the average total cost, then the firm is making economic losses. In the short run, they can decide whether they keep operating or not. If the price is above the average variable cost, though, then that means that at least some of their fixed costs are being covered by the revenues that they earn. And so it makes sense for them to continue operating, because if they don't operate, they will have to pay their fixed costs until the long run, when they can get out of their contracts or whatever that's holding them to their capital, keeping them in the short run, and get out of the industry and exit the industry. And so the price needs to be below the average variable cost for the firm to decide to shut down, because that's the only time where the revenues they'll be earning won't even be covering the wages of their employees, let alone any of their fixed costs. So if the price is below the average variable cost, the firm should shut down. That's why the minimum of the average variable cost curve is known as the shutdown price, and the minimum of the average total cost curve is known as the break-even price. So those characteristics and those relationships are pretty much intact when it comes to a monopolist. The shutdown condition for the monopolist is that there exists no quantity for which the demand curve lies above the average variable cost curve. So if the average variable cost curve is above the price over the entire range of demand, then that is the situation that would require the firm to shut down, because regardless of what they're going to charge, depending on their profit maximizing condition, they will not even be able to cover the variable cost of producing, and therefore they should stop operating and just pay the fixed cost until the long run when they can get out. Is there a question? So it's basically the same thing. It's just, again, you don't have that flat, perfectly elastic demand curve like a perfectly competitive firm does. They face a downward sloping demand curve, and so the shutdown condition is the point where the demand curve is below every point on the average variable cost curve. Now, as far as the supply curve goes, that positively sloped supply curve that we are all very familiar with, that supply curve is actually very specific to just the perfectly competitive markets. So beyond perfectly competitive markets, firms don't actually have a clear-cut supply curve. So the monopolist not being a price taker means that there's no unique correspondence, there's no unique relationship between price and marginal revenue when the market demand curve shifts. So a given marginal revenue value for one demand curve can correspond to one price, while the same value of marginal revenue for a second demand curve corresponds to a different price. So because of that, it's possible to observe the monopolist producing and selling at P star in one period and then selling at a different P star in a different period, which means that there's no clear-cut relationship between price and quantity. And that is what a supply curve is. So monopolists thus have a supply rule, which is to equate marginal revenue and marginal costs. But again, there's no clear-cut relationship between price and quantity, and therefore there is no supply curve, unlike the perfectly competitive firm that has a supply curve. It is their marginal cost above the minimum of their average variable cost. And then we were able to get to the actual market supply curve by doing horizontal summation across prices along all of those marginal cost curves. But again, you can't do that with a monopolist because of the fact that they're setting the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost as opposed to price equal to marginal cost. So they have a supply rule, no actual curve. So the markets that that market model that you guys are so familiar with that we started looking at the beginning of the semester is a market for a perfectly competitive market. It doesn't define outcomes for every type of market, only markets where firms don't have market power. But the insights that you gain and the intuition you gain from that market model is enough to give you a general idea of how most markets operate. But if you want to be precise about it, you cannot depend on it to explain exactly what's happening in markets that have market power. We'll see the same thing with monopolistically competitive firms as well as the oligopoly markets. Neither of them will have supply curves because, again, they do have market power and therefore they do set their prices and their quantities based on that supply rule, setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. All right, in the long run, adjustments. So again, in the long run, if there are profits in perfectly competitive markets, firms will enter the market, the supply curve will shift to the right, equilibrium price will drop, and eventually zero economic profits will be made by all firms in perfectly competitive markets. In a monopoly, there are barriers to entry. Firms cannot enter the market in the long run. That is basically what the definition of a monopoly is. So a monopolist can adjust all inputs, and thus the optimal quantity in the long run for a monopolist with given technology. I forget what I'm saying there. Just forget what I wrote there. Just know that in the long run, the firms, again, the monopolists, they're basically going to do exactly what they've been doing. And they're going to look at their extra revenue that they can gain from selling. They're going to adjust their inputs to get to those cost-minimizing input mixes that happen at that point where the slope of their ISO quantity is equal to the slope of their ISO cost line that you guys are so familiar with. So in the long run, they will adjust their inputs to even lower their costs and potentially lower their marginal costs, which will then increase their profits even more. But as long as their average total cost curve is below the demand, they will be making profits, and those profits will persist. So unlike a perfect competition setting, a monopolist does not make profit. A monopolist does make profits in the long run. So in this case, here we've got the long run average cost curve. Here's the average total cost curve, tangent to it. In the long run, the firm will, again, just maximize their output at the point where their marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And again, if price is above the average cost of producing, there's going to be profits and nobody will be able to take it away from them. What we'll see in monopolistically competitive markets, though, that also face downward sloping demand curves, in the long run, firms will enter the market and supply something similar to what they're selling, which means that the demand curve will shift to the point where it is just tangent to the average total cost curve, and therefore there will be zero economic profits for those type of firms. But again, that is not the case for a monopoly. A monopoly will face no competition, neither in the short run nor in the long run. But as I mentioned, monopolies are inefficient. They do result in a loss of mutually beneficial transactions from occurring. So this is the most efficient a market can be. It is the result from the perfectly competitive market model that we've looked at in the prior chapter, where equilibrium in the market happens at the point where price equals marginal cost for all firms. The supply curve equals the sum of all of their individual marginal cost curves above the minimum of the average variable cost. And producer surplus and consumer surplus is the most it possibly can be. Everybody's doing great as they possibly can in these markets. That's not the case with a monopoly. Let's look at how that looks graphically. So the monopoly power a monopolist enjoys often does imply some social cost to society. Here we just assume a constant marginal cost I'm sorry, increasing marginal cost. We don't, so therefore we're just assuming decreasing returns in this production process, just to simplify, just to easily identify the deadweight loss that we're going to see in a second. For simplicity, the curves are graphed as linear functions of output, and the position of the average cost curve is suppressed for now. All right, so this firm, the monopolist, supplies at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and they charge this price up here. The monopolist produces less than a firm would in the same type of industry, where they would set their price equal to their marginal cost. So the perfectly competitive firm would set price equal to marginal cost and therefore supply QC, which obviously is greater than QM. So the amount that's transacted in the market in a monopoly situation is less than that of a competitive market. The price in the competitive market would be set here, whereas the monopoly price is set here. So obviously monopoly prices are higher as well. And the shaded area represents the deadweight loss of monopoly. That is the welfare loss to society due to the monopolist producing output below the competitive level. So we can measure this deadweight loss as just the area of this triangle here. So we have a base of the triangle, and then we've got the height of the triangle. So the height of the triangle will be the difference between the competitive price and the monopoly price, and then the base of the triangle will be the difference between the competitive quantity and the monopoly quantity is how you get the height. And then the base is equal to the difference between the monopoly price and the marginal revenue or the marginal cost of producing the monopoly quantity times 1/2. So that's our base there, and that's our height. Let's do a practice problem just to kind of drive home all these ideas and quantify that deadweight loss, and then we will call it a day. So you own a monopoly over diamond production. You face the following inverse demand function, P equals 762 minus 22Q in the short run. Your total cost is 57Q plus 200. What would your marginal revenue be if you were producing 10 diamonds? So what is the marginal revenue function, first of all? Minus 44Q, right? Just double the slope in absolute value. Very good. How are we going to figure out the marginal revenue if you were producing 10 diamonds? Just plug it into the marginal revenue function, right? So here's our inverse demand function. We're going to double the slope in absolute value to get to the marginal revenue. And now plugging in 10 diamonds there is going to get us to the marginal revenue to be $322. That means selling an additional unit, selling an 11th diamond would generate $322 worth of extra revenue. Yeah.
So why is the marginal revenue 2 times absolute value?
Because it's a linear demand, and it just so happens when you have linear demand that the marginal revenue will be twice as steep as the demand curve. The intercept will be half as much, and the slope will be twice as much in absolute value. It's just a property of the mathematical specification of demand. So it's just the very simple case that we consider in this class. All right, so that's the marginal revenue. What is the optimal amount of diamonds that you are willing to supply? Assume that fractional numbers are possible. So how do we figure that out? What is the condition again that the monopolist uses to set their profit maximizing level of output? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? What is the marginal cost of production? It's 57. So we're going to set 57 equal to 762 minus 44Q. Marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. And then you can just, of course, just solve for that quantity. Subtract 762 from both sides, divide both sides by negative 44. Optimal quantity in this case is 16.02 diamonds. That will maximize their profits. Part 3, what is the optimal price you would be willing to sell each diamond for? So how do we get that? How does a monopolist set their price? Not the production equation. What is it called? Inverse demand function. But you were correct, of course. I know you know what you're talking about. All right. So, yes, the monopolist, once having set their profit maximizing level of output, figures out what people are willing to pay for it by plugging it in to the inverse demand function, doing a little bit of math. That's going to get us to $409.56 for some crappy stinking diamond. All right, what is your marginal revenue at this level of production? So how do we get that? Into the marginal revenue, exactly. So just take marginal revenue and plug in 16.02 there. It's going to get us 57.12. What would be the optimal level of output if this was a competitive industry equilibrium? So what is the profit maximizing condition that a perfectly competitive firm follows to set their optimal quantity? And what does marginal revenue equal for a perfectly competitive firm? Equals price. So they set price equal to marginal cost. All right, so let's do that. Let's set price equal to marginal cost. So our marginal cost is equal to 57, and we set our price, which is 762 minus 22, Q equal to it. And then we can solve for Q, doing a little bit of algebra. So the competitive quantity would be 32.05, which is nearly twice as much, as the monopolist. What would be the optimal competitive price? Right, exactly. So plug in 32.05 into our inverse demand function, and that's going to get us to what the competitive price would have been, which is $56.90. Significantly less than $400 some odd that the monopolist charges. What is the deadweight loss from having a monopolist control output and pricing in this market? All right, so think back to that graph. Again, we're looking at that deadweight loss. So we're looking at the height of the triangle, which is going to be the difference between the competitive output and the monopoly output, and then the base of the triangle, which is equal to the difference between the monopoly price and the marginal revenue at that price, at that quantity. So we're looking for this amount here. So there's our base, QC minus QM, and then PM over marginal revenue. So 0.5 times the difference between the monopolist price, the marginal revenue for the monopolist. So that's, again, the base. And then the height is the difference between competitive quantity minus monopoly quantity. Plugging in all the values that we got from all the previous parts of our problem, we get to our deadweight loss, which we can quantify as $2,824. So essentially that tells us that because the monopolist has market power and they're able to charge a price above their marginal cost, then we get $2,824 loss in surplus in this market that could have existed if the monopolists did not do what they are prone to do, and the market was able to have the competitive outcome that is the most efficient, that is ultimately what would work best for all participants in the market. All right, folks, we're done for the day. We have one more class to go for the second exam. Make sure you make the best of these next couple of days. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Have a good one.